And with that, then, I would like to introduce to you all Mr. Rick Benjamin. We're so glad to have him with us today. And I'm going to read a quick bio. Conductor, musicologist, and author Rick Benjamin has built his exciting and one-of-a-kind career through the discovery and performance of historic American music. He is a tireless collector of lost scores, which, once found, he uses to tell the story of America's music through concerts, broadcasts, and recordings. Mr. Benjamin's odyssey began in 1985 when, as a Juilliard undergraduate, he rescued the lost orchestral archives of the legendary Victor Phonograph Company. This major discovery encompassed nearly 4,000 forgotten orchestral scores by hundreds of important American composers, including Scott Joplin, Edward McDowell, W.C. Handy, Victor Herbert, Jerome Kern, and John Philip Sousa. In 1988, Mr. Benjamin made his formal conducting debut by bringing some of these treasures to Lincoln Center's Alice Tully Hall. Highly praised by the New York Times, this concert successfully launched Mr. Benjamin's unique career. Today, Mr. Benjamin is the leading exponent of historic American music, the vibrant sounds of early Broadway, silent movies, and vintage dance. He's conducted special programs of this music across 49 states and 7 countries in major venues including the Ravinia Festival, the Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian Institution, Chautauqua, the Kimmel Center, New York's 92nd Street Y and City Center, Austria's Bruckner House, the U.S. Pavilion of the World's Fair in Seville, Spain, as well as hundreds of America's movie palaces and historic theaters. For the past 30 years, Rick Benjamin has been artistic director and pianist of the Paragon Ragtime Orchestra, the noted repertory ensemble that he founded at the Juilliard School. PRO tours year-round and has recorded 17 critically acclaimed and Billboard-charted albums. Recently, Mr. Benjamin was honored to receive 3 major critics awards for his box set recording of Scott Joplin's opera Treemonisha, Gramophone's Editor's Choice, BBC Music's Opera of the Month, and Stereophile's Record of the Month. Rick Benjamin is also a leading expert on silent film music and has conducted for more than 650 screenings with the Paragon Ragtime Orchestra, the Irish National Orchestra, Denmark's Aalborg and Aarhus Denmark's symphonies. Sorry, can't quite pronounce that. The New Jersey Symphony, the Iceland Symphony, the Virginia Symphony, so on and so forth. Away from the concert stage, Rick Benjamin's melding of outstanding scholarship with superb musicianship has made him a sought-after resource for both the entertainment industry and academia. He has lectured at more than 100 universities, and his historic recreations have been heard in productions by the Walt Disney Company, the BBC, NPR, PBS, HBO, Turner Classic Movies, FX for American Horror Story, and more. So we are really, really honored that Rick has taken the time to speak with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mr. Benjamin. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. And that's quite an introduction. Are you getting me on here? Am I coming through okay, William?
Yes, you are. Sorry, I had another thing. Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, I saw the face and I wondered if I was on the air. So anyway, thank you for that wonderful introduction and this fascinating opportunity to talk today. And I know your subject matter is spectacle and power, and that really fits in intriguingly with American movie music, which is one of my specialties, and the whole world of moving pictures and the presentation thereof. So I wanted to talk to you today about that intersection, the development of motion picture music in the United States, its influences on audiences, and its intermingling with the artistry of making motion pictures as well, culminating in the 1920s with the development of spectacular structures that became known as movie palaces. So along the way, I'm going to be doing a little bit of chatting about this, but I also have some examples to show to you, both video and some audio, and a lot of still pictures too. So that's what we're going to do. It should take about an hour. If you have questions, I'd be happy to hear from you. We are going to do a Q&A at the end, though. So that's the basic setup. At this point, I've been working with early motion pictures, conducting and reconstructing scores for 35 years. And now I'm over 700 performances conducting orchestras for for movie presentations in theaters, 300 old theaters actually at this point. And so, as one critic said not too long ago, there's nobody still above ground with as much experience. And I guess that's true. I'm maybe the last of the movie house maestros. So, but I have found it helpful talking to students and folks who want to learn about all of this world, that we need to actually go back into the early days and really get into the development of film itself, because that's getting to be so far enough away that we need to review that anyway. So we have to go back to the early 1890s and revisit the invention of what Thomas Edison called the kinetoscope, and that was one of his inventions that was created with assistance of a bunch of his co-workers there. So let's take a look here. I'm going to hopefully get you some images now. We'll take a look. Oh, but before we even get into that, though, let's take a look at what a performance of a silent film in a cinema would look like. This is something that I was doing with my own orchestra just a year or two ago. Be better to start with this. So let's see if we can get going with this here. All right, a little example of cinema circa 1920. That was the original mark of Zorro with its score. And you notice there's a big screen. The musicians are creating the music there live. That's about a 12-piece pit orchestra with theater organ. And the audience is actually interacting with what's happening. They're swept along by the majesty and power of this whole spectacle. So that's sort of a modern recreation of what we're talking about. And now, I should have run that first, but I just saw that cue. Anyway, this is kind of a tech dress rehearsal, isn't it? All right, we'll fix it in the editing room. Let's take a look now. We'll go back and speak about just the invention of the art form here. We'll look at a couple things. So we've got, here we go. Gotta hit the right button. Just so everybody gets to see him. Mr. Thomas Alva Edison there, showing off his light bulb. He's got that canny look about him, doesn't he? Get rid of him. Some actual strips of film. People are amazed to see film at this point because everything now is so intangible, but that is physical 35 millimeter film from the 1890s. There wasn't a way to project for quite a number of years. So to watch a film, you would stare at it in a kinetoscope. This is a sort of a penny arcade kind of machine. You'd put your eyes into this peephole here, and the machine would run and show you a short film, just a number of seconds. But that was electrifying entertainment. It took a few more years for Edison to figure out how to actually project an image on a screen. And actually, he ended up buying a device by another inventor. And that's, of course, didn't advertise the fact that he had done that. But then we called it the Projecting Kinetoscope. And these earliest exhibits of moving pictures, once you could throw something onto a screen and sell tickets to an audience, were the earliest ways that folks could experience this as a communal event. And the films were shown absolutely silently, and the entire hook, the entire interest was the technology itself. That here, for the first time in human history, was an image that actually moved, and that was it. People would pay their money to come and see it. Films were often used as adjuncts in other types of performances. Vaudeville, for example, a motion picture exhibition will be the last in the bill of fare of a vaudeville show. And that was a little bit of a sly thing, because exhibitors, managers discovered that while audiences would stay and demand an encore from a live performer, if they put a film at the end, they would watch it and leave. And then the theater could be refilled for the next show. So the continuous vaudeville people like that. It took until 1903 for films to actually for filmmakers to actually discover that they could use these images to tell stories. And that sounds remarkable to us. But the early films were simply vignettes. You'd have the ocean, waves on the seashore. You'd have a train coming into the station. Very simple little realistic scenes. It wasn't until 1903 that directors, if you wanted to call them that, discovered you could actually stitch these scenes together and create a narrative. And that was remarkable. Most historians agree that the Great Train Robbery, an Edison production from 1903, was the first film. All right. So, but now we need to add another dimension to build power. We need to add a dimension, and that would be music. And but this came about in a sort of an interesting way. It wasn't an artistic device really at all. The early projectors were in the house itself. You'd set up the machine in the balcony. And these mechanisms, these devices, were loud. They clanked and they clattered, and the shutters made noises, and the Vienna movement made noises. So when the projectionist started cranking, and these things were hand cranked too, there weren't electric motors turning them, you'd hear this tremendous racket in the theater. And also, audiences were not used to sitting in the dark, complete darkness. If you were to go to an operetta or a musical comedy or a vaudeville show in 1904 or 1900, the auditorium would still be pretty well lit. This habit of turning the theater completely dark had not occurred yet. But to show a motion picture, you have to darken the auditorium. So suddenly we have hundreds of strangers sitting shoulder to shoulder in darkness. And our Victorian forebears found this unnerving, sitting there in the dark with other people. Wow, this is kind of weird. So exhibitors discovered that they could solve some of these problems with music. They could cover projector noise, they could soothe people, and they could entertain people before these films, which were still just minutes long, by having music. And this gave rise in the early 1900s to the very first experiments of playing music, and usually involving improvised piano. And the importance of matching what was happening with the music to the action on the screen wasn't there at all. I know this sounds just very strange to us, because we've all grown up with motion pictures and television and video. But you read accounts of a funeral scene on the screen, and the pianist playing a Sousa march or a lively Strauss waltz or something like that. There wasn't any aim other than covering the noise and just making a sound in the auditorium. And eventually, this is again probably mid-1900s, the idea developed that you should actually be trying to coordinate with what was happening on the screen. And this was increasing, again, artistic power, narrative storytelling. Let me just throw up a couple more photos here. We'll give you the classic photo of the early picture pianist. And this is kind of the thing that most people, when they're thinking today, if they think of it at all, early moving pictures, this is the image they get of the rattling upright piano and the ridiculous action on the screen. And there's some truth to that stereotype. Before 1910, there developed thousands of small theaters called Nickelodeons, meaning it took a nickel to gain admission. And these were small, cheap neighborhood places. Old stores that someone would sweep out and set up some folding chairs, buy a projector, and set up a bed sheet, literally, to project these films on. You'd have a small, either piano or a small combination, sometimes a violinist and maybe a drummer, again, improvising, very, very sort of harem-scarum. And I came across a 1930 reminiscence by a Nickelodeon pianist. It's a talking film, and I'm going to run that for you now. He discusses playing what it was like to play way back in the old days, 1910, and it's a minute or two. So I'll give you a shot of this too. Let's get this guy going here. Let's see. All right, where did he go? Gonna go back up here, and here he comes. We hope. There he goes. This is 1930.
Do you remember the good old days before the advent of the Fox movie tone? The News Weekly came on, and the pianist had to go all over the world to keep up with the pictures. This is my idea, and this is the way I did it many years ago. The music speaks for itself. Newport News, Virginia. Admiral Sims reviews the Atlantic Fleet. 3,000 blue jackets dressed in white. Asbury Park, New Jersey. Big baby parade is on. Nellie Pincus wins the first prize. Close-up of Nellie. St. Moritz, Switzerland. Winter sports.
All right.
Skiing, skating, and all kinds of torture.
All right. He was actually very good. I mean, he would be somebody who's actually quite excellent. If you went into his Nickelodeon, you'd get a real show. But it's just worth seeing to get an idea of what the high end in that realm would be. The high end of low end presentation, circa 1910. Gradually, filmmakers began to be frustrated with this system, very harem-scarum. D.W. Griffith himself, the great director, said, "If I ever kill anybody, it will not be an actor. It will be a musician." And that's a direct quote from D.W. Griffith about 1914 or 15 or so, because you really could, no matter how well your photo play, and that's what movies were called. They weren't called films or movies. They're called photo plays. No matter how well you photographed it, the actors and actresses performed in it, it could be devastated in a matter of seconds by improper musical handling. I think anybody today who's built a video, you're making a video of something creative, an original video, finding the music that works for it is a problem that maybe you've experienced. So when this was all brand new, a century and 10 years back, it was an even greater problem, I think. So various people came along, generally with classical music backgrounds, in an attempt to solve this problem. One of the first was a fellow named John Zamaschnik, who lived in Cleveland. He was a violinist and pianist, and was involved with the Hippodrome Theater in Cleveland, trying to create music for film exhibitions there. And what's interesting about Zamaschnik was that he was a student of Antonin Dvorak, the great Bohemian composer. And in 1912, not only to assist in his own work, but to help others around the country and to make a little bit of money too, Zamaschnik composed moving picture music, a folio. This is our working copy of it, that has music of all different kinds of possible actions on the screen. Yes, war scenes, cowboy music, grotesque or clowns, burglars, hurry for struggles, storm music, sailor music, and on and on and on. And so now, instead of just sort of kind of faking something in a very easy manner, you could read scores and quickly flip between them. So this is 1912 now, initiated the concept of actually starting and stopping your musical accompaniment with the scenes as they occurred. And again, as sort of basic to us as that seems, like, that was a new thing in 1912. And with this, the concept of an actual genre, photoplay music, an entirely new musical genre, is born. Now, still, movie makers and now musicians are starting to get interested in expanding their artistry and in this new field. And 1910 or so, there was a general understanding that these the haphazard musical presentations were really marring what they were trying to do. So they were trying to find a method of standardization. And what helped that along was the appearance of feature films in the US in 1912. So we have to differentiate between these short subjects. The average film before 1912 was a one-reeler, which is about 10 minutes of action. But after, when you combine several reels, you get towards a feature-length film. The Europeans were making long features at about this time, some of them way more than an hour in length. So that idea caught on here as well, and feature films started to be made, often based on famous literary works. So we have a feature film, a more serious intent, again, more spectacle. Any kind of improvisatory or ad hoc method of accompanying this is going to be unsatisfactory. So yet another innovation occurred, and this was called the Thematic Cue Sheet, or musical setting. And here's how this works. This is a system that filmmakers devised to create something that theater musicians could utilize systematically across the country. So the cue sheet was a written outline of each new film, giving the sequence, the timing of each scene, visual cues, the title of the piece of music to be played with the scene. And the music recommended in these early cue sheets consisted of excerpts from standard operas, symphonies, marches, dance music, snippets from musical shows, patriotic tunes, and arrangements of current popular songs. And this cue sheet was then duplicated and sent out with every copy of the film. You'd get this 4-page leaflet came with the cans of film. And this is a great advance, opening the way for truly synchronized, sensitive musical accompaniment. So I've made my film, whether it be a short subject or a feature, thousands of copies of it are made, and the cans of film come with this 4-page leaflet called The Setting. And Sparky, the projectionist, gets the films. He runs up to the booth. And I, as musical director of the Dismal Seepage, Ohio Orpheum Theater, grabs the cue sheet and goes down into the music library. Every theater, as part of its regular equipment by this time, had a sheet music library, and that was stored under the stage in special racks. And if you were going to have a working cinema, you needed to have 3,000 or 4,000 pieces of music there. And the cue sheet would specify these really standard kinds of things that everyone was supposed to have. So I'll show you a cue sheet. Let's see here. Click this here button. Get this. We'll get rid of our movie pianist here. Goodbye. Give you a standard cue sheet look here. This is one from a slightly later period. This is from probably the mid-1920s, but this is the kind of thing. This is a 4-page brochure. You see it's very cheaply printed and on cheap paper, sort of thrown together. And this would go out by the thousands to every cinema that was going to run this picture. So it gives you your action cue over here, and what's happening, another action cue, or a title cue over here, what that title card, when it flashes on the screen, it tells you what piece of music you're supposed to be playing, how many minutes and seconds over here, and then gives you the actual snippet of the melody showing you where within this composition you're supposed to start. So this was very, very helpful now when you've got to start and stop and perform with a film on short notice. Basically, you'd have to put this together. The music director would put this together in an afternoon or so, do a rehearsal Monday morning, and then for a week or two, this production would run in the theater. Years ago in the 1980s, I've interviewed a number of film musicians from that period, and one of the guys told me was kind of funny. He said, "Yeah, I used to tell my friends and family not to come until Thursday night, because it took them that many times through it to really get it together." Well, so okay, now we're moving on. We've got the films are getting more advanced. The storytelling techniques are getting better. Now we have accompaniment that's competent and it's supporting the narrative. We're building power, basically energy here. The next thing that we need is a special kind of place to perform this activity, meaning a purpose-built building, a theater just for this, because everything that was going on up to this time was either a ramshackled sort of storefront, Nickelodeon, or it was a vaudeville theater or a music hall of some kind, a Victorian building, not really suited to this structure. So it wasn't until 1913 that the first actual purpose-built cinema went up in this country, and that was the Regent Theater. It was built in New York City, and it was strictly designed to show moving pictures. And what it did, amongst other things, was really technologically getting this together, getting good angles for projection, getting a proper screen with a proper coating on it, proper projection equipment, the best of all that stuff. The Regent normalized the accompaniment, the musical experience of the films, normalized orchestral music, real orchestral music, moving away from the small little combos and piano players. So it's an extremely important development. I'll give you a couple of pictures of the Regent here. Let's see if I can find it. Whoop. Correct button. Here is the interior of the Regent. There we go. Ooh, some patterning here. Sorry about that. This is from an old magazine. So this is 1913. And we're looking at the proscenium and stage of the Regent Theater. The stage is so narrow you can't do anything else with it. But behind this curtain here is the screen. This is about a 1,000-seat theater. And the orchestra here is just as much the show. You'll see the guys here. Down here we have an organ, which is used to support the orchestra and also to play for shows that are traditionally less well attended. And we also have, if you'll notice over here in these side galleries here, we have singers, so that between films there would be musical entertainment. And this thing in the center here is really weird. This is a fountain, which I assume they turned off during the presentation of the pictures and the music, but there's a fountain center stage. So anyway, that's a rare look at the Regent in New York in 1913. In 1914, another development occurred, again, moving us towards the modern cinema, and that was the invention of photoplay music, actual music composed for screen situations. Up until this time, all the music that all of these live musicians were playing was pre-existing classical music or popular music. but there wasn't anything specifically written for movies until 1914, and that's when this whole new genre appeared. It's called photoplay music, and these were short pieces designed to be used specifically with the cue sheet system. And each piece was devoted entirely to one action or mood. And there were quite a few basic categories. There was hurry, love, agitato, comic, misterioso, furioso. I should have taken a bigger breath. Appassionato, romance, storm, andante, battle, dramatic tension, nature, sinister, grandioso, oriental, tragic, western, heroic. And there were a couple really specialized things, the natural disaster categories. We have a file in our collection. We have 900 of these things here. We have a special file for volcanic eruptions and submarine attacks too, because you just don't know when that's going to happen. And I happen to have right here, but this is a pile of photoplay orchestra music that we're currently working on for productions next season. When we present, we do it just the way it was done at this time period I'm talking about, where we use the cue sheets and put it together. So here is agitato number 1. For excitement, anxiety, and fear, which sometimes I feel when I'm doing an online lecture. You hear this in the background, lots of diminished chords. So basically an entire world now of sound is developing, of repertoire. A major publishing industry developed around this. And composers were starting to get the idea that here was an entire new world, a new field for musical composition, classical music. So in other words, we had opera, we had the symphonic world, we have chamber music, and a few other fields. But wow, here is a whole new area for composition and presentation. It's going to be films. People will go to the movies not just to see the pictures, but to hear incredible music composed by a new generation of Beethovens and Mozarts that just deal with the screen. It's kind of a cool idea, and it sort of happened, as we'll see in the next few minutes. Anyway, it wasn't, but it took until 1915 for the first actual composed score, original score for a specific film to happen. That was written by Joseph Carl Briel for Griffith's Birth of a Nation. But this practice didn't become widespread, the practice meaning of composing an actual full-length score for a specific film. And there were a number of reasons for that maybe will go beyond the purview of today's talk. But the essence of the idea is that most films of the silent era were accompanied by music that pre-existed and through the cue sheet system that went pretty much through the entire era, despite what you might have heard or not. Anyway, the idea of building cinemas and the moving picture industry and the exhibition part of it really exploded in the 1910s. By 1916, there were 21,000 movie theaters in the United States, and that's a lot. I mean, that's probably more than there are McDonald's restaurants now. I'm not sure about that. I'll have my crack research team work on that statement before I'm contradicted by everyone on YouTube. But anyway, it's a lot of theaters, and all of these places had live music, obviously. And about half of these 21,000 actually employed orchestras. The minimum size of an ensemble would be about 10 players. 45 wasn't uncommon. Later in the 20s, we'll see some monstrously large musical ensembles playing for films in the big cities. Orchestral accompaniment became the standard to be met. It was a sign of serious presentation. And the cue sheet and photoplay music system achieved the dominance and remained the musical standard to the end of this era. So let's take a look, a couple more illustrations here to show to you. And any questions at this point from anyone?
I think we'll probably hold the questions till the end for you.
Okay, that's fine, because I'm on a roll, as you can see. I think. Hope we'll keep it going. All right, let's look at a few things here. Pop in here. We'll go back to my magical desktop. We'll get rid of the Rialto. Well, the Regent. We'll go to the next one, the next really important cinema, and this is the Rialto, also in New York City. And you'll notice now we're really building on this idea of spectacle. Their slogan, the Rialto, the temple of the motion picture. And then down here, we've got, their further tagline, the Shrine of Music and Allied Arts, Broadway and 42nd Street. So, and this is kind of important too. You'll see down at the bottom here, personal direction of S.L. Rothapfel. And this guy, Samuel L. Rothapfel, really fascinating figure. A couple of books have been written about him. A major mind, a mastermind of movie presentation. His nickname was Roxy, and became world famous. In fact, the name Roxy is all over the place even now. But Roxy was the fellow who was behind raising the standards of presentation. He started in the Marines, actually. He was an ex-Marine who managed a Nickelodeon in Pennsylvania someplace, and taught himself a whole bunch of different things, music, art, architecture, and arrived in New York about this era, the early 1910s, and started just taking charge of presentation, getting people to give him huge amounts of money to build cinemas on Broadway. And the Rialto was one of them. And he's really just an absolute genius. There, in my notes, you'll see in the bibliography, there's a relatively new biography of him, and it's worth reading if you're interested in the presentation of entertainment to the public. The story of Roxy is an important one. So we'll get another slightly more close-in look here. And again, this is from an old magazine in the collection here. But you'll see this area here, I'm circling with my cursor, the screen is behind that. It's got a fire curtain over it in this photo, in this picture. But that's the screen. So it's a rather small thing. And the grandeur of the building is quite a bit of the show. And this quite large orchestra, it's about 40 pieces down here. And these galleries on the side are just decorative, but it's interesting that the music and the architecture are co-partners with the actual image that you're going to see on the screen. And that's tended to be the theme throughout the silent era, really, the melding of these different arts towards one direction. Let me give you we'll take a look at a couple more photos here, and let me just get that out of the way. Okay, everything is going smoothly here. It's tiny buttons. I've got my 6 sets of extra glasses sitting here so I can see all the tiny little things here. All right, let's take a look at some ensembles of the time period playing for films. This is a little bit hard to see. This is 1915. I think this is in the Midwest someplace. But we've got an organ here, maybe 20-piece instrumentation. This is, I really like this picture. These are all from our collection here too. This is Lowe's Orpheum in New Brunswick, New Jersey. This is 1920. And again, the screen is back here behind this colorful curtain. And the ensemble is quite massive there, and the organ's probably on a lift so that this console can actually disappear. Here's one. This is really a really interesting one. This is 1916. I'm sorry it's so blurry. I've got to do a better scan of this. This is actually an original photo in our collection. This is the Piccadilly Theater in Rochester, New York. And what's cool about it is that their conductor and music director was Susan Tompkins, and there she is, pioneer lady conductor of all kinds of things, but cinema. And apparently doing a bang-up job there in Rochester, which of course is the home of Eastman Kodak, which is the company that was making all of the world's movie film. So I think there's probably quite a bit of interest in what she was doing. Things got bigger into the 1920s, meaning larger size groups. This is the Rivoli Theater in Baltimore. And they probably have 40 people there. Now we notice the screen is getting bigger too, the screen behind the curtain there. One sort of side note too, I guess, is when we see these pictures like this, you always see the main curtain closing, concealing the screen. It was considered bad manners to have the blank screen sitting there facing the audience. And we made that mistake one time about 15 years ago in Kansas City. We were doing a silent film presentation in an old theater, and actually the critic for the Kansas City Star actually took it out on us for leaving the curtain open between the films. So there's a great deal of sensitivity apparently to hiding the screen when there wasn't something happening on it. It's a little trade secret there, in case. Here's a photo of the Mastbaum Theater in Philadelphia. This is 1929, and there's 75 people there ready to play for Westerns and or the latest Tom Mix cartoons or newsreels or whatever. This picture is enormous. Here's a photograph of me actually holding on to this. So all right. Well, this moves us into the 1920s and really to the point of our conversation about spectacle and power. And we enter the movie palace era, where Marcus Lowe, one of the big exhibitors, owned and built many theaters, said, we're selling tickets to theaters, not to movies. And so by the early 1920s, the movie presentation has now become a billion-dollar business. And exhibitors were competing with each other for audience share by building ever larger and ever more luxurious theaters. And they became known as movie palaces, sometimes picture palaces. And there were 4,000 of these super deluxe structures built between 1915 and 1922. And most large cities witnessed the erection of half a dozen or more of these buildings. And enormous and grand they were, designed by noted specialist architects, all employed staffs of hundreds of people. You'd have not only your music staff, but front of house, ushers, managers, concessionaires, stage crews. These were hugely labor-intensive operations. But the purpose of them was to create an immersive fantasy world where everyday people could imagine that they were aristocrats. They arrived at this magical place, and for 35 cents, they would be taken by a uniformed footman kind of person to their plush velvet seat in this enormous, gorgeous, beautiful building. And while these centers of spectacle and power were devised primarily for commercial gain, there was some intersection with artistic aims as well. Some of the exhibitors, in fact, I might even say many of them, Roxy certainly, were just as interested in the artistic side of things as they were in getting returns on their investments. And this time period, the 20s, also begins the rise of studio-owned nationwide chains of theaters, including movie palaces. But we see the creation of the Fox chain, Lowe's, Warner, and there were several others too. So the movie studios were actually beginning to use a unified model where they were producing the product and then they were also selling it themselves too. So something I think they've got from the automobile industry. So no longer was Hollywood just making films and sending them out in the world and counting their money. They were actually in charge of showing them too. And so that was an interesting time period. So I'm going to just show you a few quick photos of some palaces, and we'll go back to my messy desktop here. I'll click into the Movie Palace folder here. A quick shot of the Rialto while we're going. That's the front of the Rialto. We talked about that moments ago. This giant electric sign that blinked in a variety of different colors. Inside of the Ambassador. This is in St. Louis. And again, you just see the opulence of this place. You'd be ushered in there. And let's see, the Fox in Detroit. Again, massive places, 4,000 and 5,000 seat auditoriums. This is the Fox in San Francisco. That's just the side view. So looking from one of the boxes, house right. Unbelievable. This is Lowe's Paradise in the Bronx, New York, which is still there. You can still visit. Is still picture. That's the proscenium. This thing is called the proscenium. And the screens here, orchestra is down there. I love this cartoon. This is an old New Yorker cartoon from 1929. The little girl goes into one of these places and says, "Mama, does God live here?" So that's sort of indicative of the effect. Yeah, I mean, that's the effect that you were going for. The Paradise Theater in Chicago. I've been looking around for a really good website of Movie Palace photos, and it's difficult. I didn't see anything really good. These are mostly from our reference materials here at Photographs. This is an exterior. This is Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood, which is still there. This is an opening night for something, a premiere. People are arriving, and again, the spectacle. This is the Paramount in New York, Times Square. From the beginning, just the very beginning of your approach to one of these places, you would start to have this experiential thing happening to you with the lights and the excitement, and then you'd be greeted by the staff of ushers, in uniforms, military, zipping around, and here's the Roxy. This is really one of the last of Samuel Rothfeld's theaters, and probably the grandest. He was involved with Radio City Music Hall after this, but he wasn't exactly in charge of that project. But this is the Roxy, named for him, 1927 in New York, and this is a view of the proscenium, and you can see. I'll blow it up a little bit. No one is sitting in the pit, but there's the orchestra pit. The Roxy had the largest orchestra in the entire world, 110 musicians playing 3 times a day. The largest group in the world down here in the pit. What a sound they must have made. A couple more pictures of the Roxy. It's from the stage. You'd go from the outside into the rotunda after you plunk down your 35 cents, and then up the stairs into the gallery. So again, the experience is building. And these things were enormously complicated to run. This is the light board just for the stage. So you'd need just a squad of stagehands to handle all that stuff. It's an interesting cutaway too. And this is a model for many movie palaces of that time period, but projection room is actually in the front of the balcony. The balcony is hollow, so they can do a straight shot onto the screen, preventing keystoning. For those of you that are into projection, you want to avoid the keystone. So you need a straight on kind of line of sight thing. Anyway, typical ad, the Roxy, the cathedral of the motion picture. And when you see ads or you get a program from one of these theaters, very often the actual film they were showing is the hardest thing to find in the program. They'll list all the other things that are happening, and then you'll see, oh, yes, Douglas Fairbanks in His Majesty the American in tiny little print somewhere. People really were coming to go into this building. That seems to be quite true. Many of the places even had their own magazines. That's the Roxy magazine that you get when you go and see a show. They hand you that, and you go home with that. And yeah, I mean, it's actually some pretty good, gives you just the whole flair of the idea they were trying to project with this, of all of these, this artistry that's sort of floating up and out of here. Evocative. All right. You turn the page here. Is anyone still awake out here? Yes. And this developed, I mean, you can see the relationship too between these buildings, the music and the architecture, how this is all coming together. We have to remember the famous Goethe quote that architecture is simply frozen music too. So very closely related. The Roxy that we were just looking at had 5,920 seats. And in many days, that place was filled. If you can imagine going to see a film with 5,000 other people laughing, sighing, crying, booing. It's a very unifying thing. Musical accompaniment at this point is absolutely fully unified, and with seamless presentations as far as we can tell. Really, music matching everything that's happening. The people in charge of this now were very, very skilled at what they were doing. In fact, quite a few of them ended up going to Hollywood later, which we'll get into briefly. We should also mention the theater organ too, which was an important instrument. It was used, mentioned it briefly, but as an adjunct to the orchestra. But it was also becoming such a mighty machine. We have a couple of pictures here. Just such a mighty machine in and of itself. This is the console of the organ from the Fox Theater in Seattle, Washington. You see it has 4 manuals. That means keyboard. All of the different stops here. So on days when of low attendance, typically like Wednesday afternoon matinee, Saturday morning perhaps, the management wouldn't engage the orchestra because that was extraordinarily expensive. So they'd have the organist play the whole show, just solo on these mighty machines that essentially simulated organs. And there were some fabulous players that became cult personality kind of people. There's a lady player, and I forget her name, but there were dozens of women who were celebrity players in the 1920s, playing theater organs in major theaters. Gotta mention that too. Well, let's talk a little bit about the sounds you might be hearing in these places too. This is another thing that was sort of gratifying and exciting to audiences, because you'd actually get to hear orchestral music. Most people, then and now, didn't hear large groups of orchestral instruments playing together. So this was an opportunity to hear orchestras play, and this also led to the feeling of grandeur of going into one of these places, because this fancy building and this great seat and the guy in the uniform, and there's a symphony orchestra sitting there playing for us. And we've been involved, of course, in playing for many years this kind of material, and a few years ago, New World Records commissioned us to actually record photoplay music from original scores so that people today could hear what it sounded like. So let's listen to a little bit. Here's a piece by Mr. Axt, who was a conductor at the Capitol Theater. And it's called Appassionato, used in many films. Let's see if you can hear this. So it's very, very powerful. It's a piece by William Axt. Here's another of his pieces. He wrote wonderful music, and eventually did go to Hollywood when sound film came along and ruined Western civilization as we know it. But it's a little joke there. This is a cue that he wrote for scenes of savagery and strange distant lands. Yeah, so we're a long way from the Nickelodeon. I mean, this is sophisticated, professional grade music, and at the silent era marked the high water mark of employment for professional musicians in the United States. Probably about 100,000 orchestral musicians working at that time. Never matched that number after the end of this era to this day. No, let's do this. Is since we're talking about grand things, this is Grandioso by Otto Lange. Yeah. Oh, and I've got to do one more here. Let's see. The Mystery Hurry. Let's try this. This is called Agitato Drammatico. It's for chases through darkened streets. That's what it's for. They must have reached safety, I think. They've reached safety, I suppose. So we could go on, I mean, literally for days. We recorded, I'll hold it up here again. This is the Pioneers of Movie Music on New World Records. And it's, it's 75 minutes, 33 different excerpts from photoplay music by the leading composers of that time. And my talk today does have an outline, which you'll be able to download at some point. And I've listed the composers who are important. So we have obviously something going on here. This is a major success. It's artistically successful. Tens of millions of people are going weekly to experience this amazing thing. Why would it stop? What brought this all to a conclusion? And there are a number of things. The end of the silent era itself. Filmmakers, despite the glory that they could have, especially in major cities with exhibiting their films, there were still problems with exhibitions in smaller cinemas. So filmmakers were desiring to improve and standardize the presentation of their output. They also wanted to add voices to their actors and actresses. They wanted people to be able to talk as they could on the stage. So there was some pressure coming from the artistic side. There was pressure coming from the exhibitor side too. It was discovered that 3/4 of the cost of running a theater, my clock is going now, 3/4 of the cost of running the theater were the staff of musicians. So it was the most expensive part. It was more expensive than renting the film, more expensive than paying the coal to heat the building, the electric bill, etc. So exhibitors were kind of like, well, if we could find a way. In 1925, another thing happened too, the invention of the microphone, or rather the perfection of the microphone. Believe it or not, that device didn't exist before that time. So the microphone comes along with related electrical recording and amplification equipment. The following year, 1926, Warner Brothers developed something called the Vitaphone, which was sound on disc, synchronizing records to go with the moving pictures. Fox that same year developed Movietone, which is sound on film. And that system actually ended up winning. Warner Brothers, though, in 1926, released a film called Don Juan, which was the first sound feature film. In other words, it didn't require live musicians. It had a soundtrack. And it did create a sensation. It came before Al Jolson and the Jazz Singer, which everybody likes to point to as the first talking picture. Actually, it's not quite right. Let's just watch maybe 40 seconds of Don Juan with the Vitaphone sound on here, and give you some idea. Now you have the sound ringing in your ear of the Paragon Orchestra playing in an old theater live, and you can imagine now you go in there and the orchestra's gone, and this is what you're getting. Okay. So essentially, you're getting what you were getting before, except the sound quality isn't as good, and there isn't live music in the theater anymore. And you see critics and audience members and letters to the editor kind of stuff in 1926 complaining that what's happening, we don't like this sound. There's this tinny canned music now. What is this anyway? And folks on both sides of it, the exhibitors and the public, weren't exactly sure what the outcome of this was going to be, but technology ended up winning out, and the viability of talking pictures quickly caused the obsolescence of the silent film and all of these presentational methods that we were talking about. By 1929, the silent era was essentially over. And so where does that leave us with our beautiful movie palaces, these 4,000 buildings that were put up? And well, the news wasn't so good. With the arrival of sound pictures, the movie palaces had to abandon their elaborate presentational styles. So, all of these things that you get in addition to the movies, you'd have a concert, an overture, the resident opera company might sing for you, the resident ballet company might come out and do 3 minutes of Swan Lake. You get all this extra stuff. That was all gone, and the cinemas moved to films only policy. So you just go, you see a newsreel, a cartoon, and the feature film, and go home. That was the thing. And this was disastrous, of course, for musicians. As I said, there were about 100,000 people involved, and suddenly they're not. One of these guys was my grandfather, too, who was a violinist in a movie theater. And, he went from that to being a teller in a bank. So his entire world changed. Then on the heels of that change came the Great Depression, which curtailed all audience attendance. People weren't leaving the house even to plunk down 35 cents. And this result in the decline made movie palaces just physically difficult to maintain the structure, to keep the heat going and all that sort of thing. So we start seeing in the 1930s the first round of these buildings actually starting to be demolished. because the real estate they sat on was more valuable as real estate than it was as entertainment space. So then in 1948, the Supreme Court of the U.S. affirmed a case called United States versus Paramount Pictures. And that case made it illegal for film studios to own theaters, actually as an antitrust case. So suddenly Warner's, Fox, RKO, Orpheum, all these movie companies that owned all of these hundreds of theaters were not allowed to own theaters anymore. They had to sell them. They went to independent operators who typically couldn't manage this, keeping these enormous buildings, again, staffed, lit, heated, keep the roof from leaking. So we see more decline, decay, and demolition. And of course, in the 1950s, television came along and actually just sort of decimated the cinema business completely. Folks would much rather sit home in their living room and pop open the TV dinner and watch I Love Lucy than go downtown, park, and plunk down their $2 maybe to see a film in a theater. So today there are a number of surviving palaces, and if you troll around online, you can find some pictures, and hopefully you can visit some too. The Fox in Atlanta is a fantastic place. There's most of the major cities have at least one surviving building, so if you can get in there, it would be great to take a look. And so, what was the influence of all of this on society? The movie palace and its music and its soundscape. And these are just things that I've been thinking about. First, as a major inspiration for the modern American theme park, the movie palace originated the concept of experiential entertainment, this sort of complete experience. Once you go in the door, you're in another world, you're another person. And I do know from some reading that Walt Disney himself was a habitué of movie palaces, both in his hometown, in younger days, and then when he was living in California. He was a guy who would go in, to the big theaters and watch the shows, and had to have been taken by this whole overwhelming experience of sight and sound. Further influence is a force of standardization and promotion of social values and aspirations by the use of powerful imagery and ritual in a vast communal setting. Further influence of this whole thing is a force for social cohesion, as vast crowds of people from all walks of life and economic classes gather together in the same place to enjoy the same things. Essentially a functioning democratic experience where the shop girl, the mechanic, the factory worker, truck driver, and Wall Street broker, millionaire maybe, sitting in the same building watching Clara Bow or Charlie Chaplin and listening to an orchestra. And we don't have that same kind of thing today. I mean, it used to be, there was religious exercise. You'd go to church or synagogue or something. You'd go to the movies. You might go to the theater. We had some community experiences where we all learned that we're nice people and we all get to have our different ideas about things, but we still like most of the same things. But we don't have that as much today. I think that's part of what we see in the, some of the frictions of postmodern life now, because we're just not together. For example, I'm sitting in an office in Pennsylvania talking to people around the world, and it'd be much more fun to be together personally. But anyway, this is where we are. And finally, although this is maybe one of the lesser things, the techniques and this whole world of the U.S. movie palace was really taken up powerfully by British and European exhibitors in the 20s, in particular Germany. The Germans, rebuilding their country after the First World War, were really interested in this concept. And a couple of their film studios that also were building theaters really latched onto the movie palace concept and actually hired some of the impresarios from America, including Roxy, went over to Germany for a while to help them come up with an American style of film presentation. So we had a hand in changing the way things were done over there as well. So, I mean, to wrap up, before we go into Q&A, an interesting thing happened about 10 years ago, and that was the creation in France of a new silent movie about silent movies. It's called The Artist. And it's just a fascinating thing. But the film starts, it's the first silent film since 1929 to win an Academy Award. And it won 5 of them, actually, kind of amazing. But for our purposes, what's interesting is the opening sequences of this film are a recreation of an audience experiencing an epic film in a movie palace. So I wanted to close with this. It's about 3 or 4 minutes. We'll watch this clip, and then we'll go into Q&A. All right, I just have to hit the right button just one more time correctly. Oh boy, here we go. All right, that's the correct button. This is, let's get rid of Barrymore here. He's so annoying. All right, and then we come over here. All right, here we go with the artist. All right. So just the opening sequence of The Artist showing a movie palace in action in the mid-1920s. I think it's a great recreation, other than seating the trumpet player next to the flute player, which would have never happened. But anyway. So that concludes my prepared notes here, and so ready for some questions if anyone's still awake out there in motion picture land. So.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that talk. It's so fascinating. Apparently I've got some text questions I can actually ask you
Wow,
that
okay.
I've been handed here by one of my handlers. Although I've actually got a million of my own, I'll have to do my best not to monopolize. But I first want to make a couple of comments. One, I wanted to let you know you were talking about finding pictures of the movie palaces. And I just recently, I was on the Library of Congress website, and I don't know how much you've perused theirs, but they've got some photographs of movie palaces, including in their demolished state.
Yeah.
Which sad, but also good that it's been documented in that way. So,
oh, that's interesting.
I wanted to let people know that's one place that I found a handful of good ones. And then I wanted to sort of make a shameless plug for you because of that artist clip sort of reminded me. I had the pleasure to let everyone know to see a Paragon show in San Marcos, Texas, just a couple of years ago. That was a Halloween themed show that was really a lot of fun. But it was amazing that experience can still happen. I mean, it was so communal. It was so democratizing, like you were saying. It was this audience mostly of college undergraduates, actually. It was at a university. And this audience of young people who was laughing, cheering, that were completely engrossed in these films. So it's really amazing to me that this carries on, that this is thanks in part to you and the orchestra, that this can be something that we can still experience. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that too. It's the art form still works. As we were saying the other day, it's the problem today is to just get audiences, COVID aside, just getting audiences into a theater, because this is now so removed from normal experience. People know what doing the drive-through hamburger thing is, right? But well, let's go to the movies and watch old movies with an orchestra. It's out there, so you have to explain it to people. So thanks for your help in explaining it to people.
Yes, I do my best. So the first question that sort of comes to mind for me, and this might seem like a little bit of a stretch, but I was thinking about how many Americans of the past couple of generations have gotten their classical music education, have learned classical music from the Looney Tunes, right, from cartoons. And so I was wondering if there was sort of an equivalent with the early movies, right, and these sorts of scores. Are people hearing classical music and learning it from going to these types of shows?
Yeah, definitely, and both within the scores themselves that were used to accompany the films, quite a lot of classical music used, but also in between the films, any number of the exhibitors, Roxy in particular, was actually interested in raising musical tastes and educating, and so he insisted that the orchestra between films would play, let's say, a movement from a Beethoven symphony. Or an excerpt from a Verdi opera, and then you go right back into movies, and so this was all part of culturizing and educating American audiences, and this was considered an important part of the mission. So you are onto something with that, and it went the other way too, where the musicians actually, quite a number of the musicians playing these things went on to become famous classical people. For example, the assistant conductor and violinist at the Capitol Theater in New York was a little fellow named Eugene Ormandy, who went on to become one of the world's greatest classical conductors. He led the Philadelphia Orchestra for 60 years. But his first baton waving was for the movie tone newsreels at the Capitol Theater. So it flowed both ways.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. That was I wondered sort of about those kinds of similar cultural processes that might have been happening. So let me go then to this list of questions I've got here. The first is from our star guy behind the scenes, our tech director, who's been making all this happen, Kevin. Kevin would like to know, he says, as a historian of technology, the array of technical systems, instruments, screen, film, sheet music, etc., is fascinating. Is there any single technology that you think is the most important in defining the era?
Wow. Any single technology? Oh my gosh. You know, that would be a tough one to answer because to make the presentation go, you need all of these, you need all the legs of the stool to make this go. So yeah, I don't know if there's an actual answer for that question. I think I sort of understand what's behind it. Certainly, sort of a sideways answer to it is that there was a tremendous amount of advance in the handling of electricity in theaters by this time. Lighting was getting sophisticated. Projection was getting very sophisticated. The projectors were now using special arcs, and so in the electrical side of things, there's a lot of fascinating stuff going on, but the entire spectacle that we're talking about relied on the technology, the architecture, and the artistry of the actors on the screen, the cameramen who shot those scenes, the directors, and of course the musicians composing music and executing it live. So yeah, I mean, maybe the technological machine is actually this whole process, I think, going into the ears and eyes of the listener.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense. That's an article right there. That's
yeah,
machine.
That's several dissertations, I think, right in one sentence right there.
I've already got my own, so.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
All right. So let me go then to my next next question here that I've got sent in, which is, who decided which photoplay piece to use? Did films come with direction for that, or like earlier silent film, was that decided at the theaters? So who was making those artistic choices?
The decisions were made after about, say, 1912 or so. They were made by the filmmakers, the studios, usually in the West Coast, although there were still some East Coast studios. And their wishes were expressed in the form of the cue sheet that we were talking about that came with the films. So this musical setting was essentially a set of instructions to the music director of the theater as to what to play for each scene. And way back, in fact, we'll go back to that real quick if I hopefully won't louse up the system. But
no, should be good.
Let's get
we can bring that cue sheet back up.
Yeah, so here's the first page of a thematic cue sheet. So the music director of every theater in the country playing this picture, The Popular Sin, would get this, and then have to pull out these pieces of music from their in-house music library and prepare all of the orchestra books with this material. Now, that's not to say that there was some representative from the studio standing in every theater in America, making sure that Mr. Music Director actually played Hurry 17 in scene 8, because music directors did usually have the discretion to change things around for a variety of reasons. In fact, music directors had such power in the silent days, especially the movie palaces, that they actually had the right to cut the film to better fit their idea of the musical underscoring. And wow. It's really interesting, Erno Rapé at the Capitol Theater, and there are several others who were such superstars and movie palace maestros that they would watch the movie and say, it would be better if the love scene came after the car chase, and they'd actually have the film reassembled and show it with their cut, with their, the way they wanted the music to be. So that goes to show you that there's a lot that isn't generally known about the early days of the cinema. But the musicians had quite a bit of power. But to really, the specific answer to that question was that the studios, the filmmakers, directors were giving input as to what they wanted.
Wow, that's fascinating. And actually, I was going to ask about you answered the question before I asked it about the discretion of the music directors. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's astounding to me that if we're talking about power, right? The power that music directors had over the artistic process.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that actually comes from musical theater, where Broadway and musical comedy, where the music director actually really does have veto power over songs and the flow of the show. It's kind of amazing. You get your songwriter, your lyricist, your melody writer, and then the producer. But the music director can actually say, you know what, this is lagging here in Act 2. We're going to cut this song, and that's kind of how it is. And I think that feeling in the early 1900s was being brought over to the cinema, where the music director would say, "Oh man, this scene is awful. Let's just cut it." And Sparky the projectionist up there with his editing device would actually snip that out and glue the film back together.
Wow. And that makes me think too, as far as you talk about, moving from the stage to cinema, these concepts. I assume there was a lot of crossover, right? A lot of the same people involved.
Yeah, that's true. Well, many of the folks who ended up going into movie music had come from either popular theater or opera. In fact, there's probably a greater percentage coming from opera, and European folks. Some of them with tremendous pedigree. Working in the Hugo Riesenfeld, who's conducting at the Rialto and the Regent in 1915, came there directly from the Royal Opera House in Vienna. He was a big gun over there, and came over to this country with Mahler to work with him in New York with the New York Philharmonic, and then sort of stumbled into film work. So, yeah, many of the concepts about the dramatic stage, the lyric stage, opera, musical theater were directly applied to the movies. There was actually already a protocol and an infrastructure on how to handle things, and so there's tremendous overlap, and we see that too in our work performing antique show music, early Broadway music. And working with films too. It's basically the same sort of thing.
Wow. Oh man, the next question in my text questions was, were there rogue music directors? Were rogue music directors something that happened? So we just talked about that. Excellent. We're getting. You're anticipating these questions before we get them, which is excellent.
Good.
So the next thing I have here is, how much coordination existed between movie palace builders and architects, the studios and instrument manufacturers in the 1920s, or were they responding to changes organically?
I think that I think it was working in all directions too. The film companies, the architects. And a lot of times the architects were working for the film companies because, as we mentioned, the chains, the film studios were developing chains of theaters, and so they would hire an architect who had expertise in this subject matter. And regarding the instruments, the particulars of who's playing what violin or what drum set or something, not so much, but in the theaters that did have organs, theater organs, there was tremendous input with the organ companies, and there were some celebrity organ builders, Wurlitzer, Morton. Yeah. There were a number of them. Hope Jones, I think, was an earlier manufacturer, and these guys were very much in communication with the architects and with the movie musicians too, trying to figure out what was needed, what would fit into the building, and all these kinds of questions. So yeah, there's tremendous interrelation between those fields at this time. It's a great.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the way it's interesting too, the way it all interacted, like you talked about, and the use of the words like temple and cathedral, and talking about it as sort of a unifying, it almost seems like a quasi-religious experience in the way you describe it, right? Everyone experiencing those same emotions together.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And we've, again, after doing more than 700 of these things around the world, and a lot of old theaters too, that is the experience we've had, with the audience just spontaneously erupting when the hero triumphs over this bad guy. And yeah, I mean, there's a visceral community experience that you don't get. I mean, I don't think you can really enjoy silent cinema, sitting at home watching it on your computer or a DVD on your television alone, even if you've got really good popcorn. It doesn't work unless you're in a large space with lots of people, and that's how it really works.
Absolutely. I've got another question from our tech director, Kevin. Again, he's a history of technology guy, and you mentioned the automobile, as a reference, and the automobile history is also what he does.
Oh, good. Me too.
So, oh, yes, good. Then you will enjoy this question. And he asks, have you found references to Ford's assembly line, the Model T, or Fordism in the pressure from exhibitors to move to recorded audio over live music? So is the standardization being pressured from exhibitors?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone was consciously taking the Ford model of, just to review a little bit for folks, Ford's idea was to own the mines that were producing the ore, own the forests producing the wood, own the rubber plantations to produce the rubber, and then ship all that stuff in, and his own factories from these raw materials create the product and then sell the product with his own dealers. This unified model. I don't know if the movie companies were exactly following that, or whether this was something that was just in the air in the 1920s, but it was something that was in the air with the studios as they're making money, deciding they needed to control the exhibitor side of things. But again, I don't know whether they're actually specifically studying Ford, or whether this was just kind of an idea that was out there at this time, that the efficiency of doing that. And then, of course, the push to remove a lot of the staff from these buildings to cut costs, automate. Whether that was something coming from Ford or other automobile makers, I'm not quite sure. But you can definitely see the pressure is on to mechanize a lot of the presentation, and then the party was over. It's a different thing.
Yes, sent us down a path of ruin as
yes, we've never recovered. People were so depressed they decided to have a Great Depression when this happened.
All right. The next question I have is from another one of our UTA students here, who asks, are there jazz stylings found in these scores, especially with the rising popularity of jazz at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Especially, pictures, sort of realistic, current events kind of pictures, modern romances and things. Yeah, absolutely. They wouldn't have improvised jazz, but they would have simulated jazz that was scored and performed by the orchestras. Interestingly enough, the instrumentation of the theater orchestras that played for films remained the same from the very earliest days to the end of the silent film era, and that is they were classical oriented, strings, double reeds, brass, percussion, and no saxophones. I don't really see. I mean, I've never seen scores that have saxophone parts or banjo or things that were part of the dance music scene of that time. You think of jazz music, cabaret, dance band playing jazz music. You don't really see musical parts for that in the scores. But nevertheless, the ensembles did play jazz and contemporary music to accompany scenes of that nature on the screen. Good question.
Do you have any theories as to why some of those jazz instruments didn't make it into the instrumentation?
I don't really know, other than the folks who were composing the music and most of the people directing it, conducting in the theaters, had more or less classical backgrounds and were either sort of artistically opposed to adding those instruments or just uncomfortable with them. I have seen there are a number of interesting periodicals of that time period. There were magazines that actually talked about with articles on how to do this from the 1910s and 1920s, and I collect them and I have drawers full of them. And there are some interesting articles that talk about, for example, how only the stringed instruments, violins and cellos, have the emotional range to truly capture the emotional impact of the screen. So there's sort of a snobbishness to it maybe too, whereas the yowling alto saxophone perhaps cannot capture the grandeur of Douglas Fairbanks as he sweeps through the castle. It might be something like that. I don't know. There's another dissertation for somebody.
Yeah, I was going to say, because you think about, the big epic films that sort of make sense, but then you think, say, Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton, like you could hear a saxophone or a twanging banjo or a ukulele or something would make sense, thematically.
Yeah, you could. I mean, to us anyway, as modern, postmodern people watching the things, you could sort of hear that. But apparently, someone in 1922, nope, I've got a violin and a cornet and a slide trombone and some drums, and we're going. We do not need any saxophones here.
And of course, if we're talking, comedy or lighthearted things, the slide trombone offers us plenty of that.
Right. Yes, it's the monologuist of the orchestra. So, indeed. Yep.
Well, if you still have time, I do still have questions. If
you guys, I've got you booked for the afternoon here. So,
fantastic. I'm going to take this one here next. How accessible was the production of these movies? Was film something only big budget studios were producing? Especially after studios stopped being allowed to own the theaters?
Well, there were hundreds and hundreds of studios in the, starting in the 1910 period, going through the silent era. There were literally hundreds of them. And the reason for that was that it was actually relatively inexpensive to make films. You weren't capturing sound, so you needed a guy with a camera, some lenses, and some film stock. And a room somewhere where you could develop, your rushes, and so there were literally hundreds of film studios. It was quite inexpensive to do that. In fact, some of the studios that became larger, like Hal Roach, he was a truck driver actually who had a camera, and in 1913 just started kind of goofing around with making films, and he became Hal Roach, the creator of Laurel and Hardy and Harold Lloyd and all, Our Gang and all these things. So it was relatively easy to get started, and in the early days there was a tremendous voracious appetite for product. So, being, as you said, tens of thousands of cinemas by 1916, everybody needed things to put on the screen. So it was kind of a golden era to have a sort of a shoestring studio and actually sell your stuff. Didn't even have to be particularly good, and you could sell it. But as studios started to amalgamate and buy each other and combine to create MGM, it's a merger of different companies, and the real studio system as we know it started to rise in the 20s. That began to change. Production became expensive. Really, name brand actors and actresses wanted big money. You got to recall in the beginning of the movie industry. Actors and actresses didn't even get credit. I mean, you wouldn't even know who these people were that you were watching on the screen. The 10-minute thing would run and it'd be a guy and some, doing some things and be like, well, that was fun, but you didn't know who it was. It took a few years before there were actually credits, the villain played by Ford Sterling. And so, yeah, I don't know if I answered that question, but it was fun going around it anyway.
No, absolutely. You definitely did. And to sort of piggyback off of that with some of my own knowledge, and then I'll ask another question related. Animation is part of this too, right? And animation is very accessible to begin with. The Disney Brothers cartoon studio starts in 1923 in a garage in LA, basically, right? So it's just a couple of guys who are producing these cartoons, and they're being financed in part by Universal, but still it's something that they sort of start on their own. And so I'm curious what role animation plays in this process of the development of music. Are there cue sheets? Are they using these same pieces for animation? I don't know if you have any sort of...
Yeah, we haven't done a lot with animation, but there were cue sheets for cartoons, and they generally relied on these typical photoplay cues. That one we played earlier with the Savage Carnival with a xylophone and stuff was something that turned up on a lot of cartoons is required for a lot of cartoons, and actually was used in a lot of early sound cartoons too. You can hear it. So yeah, the techniques tended to be the same, but bearing in mind that the cartoons sometimes, because of the quickness of the scenes, they're cut a little bit differently than a live action film. The average length of a scene in a silent film, I used to remember this, but it's something like 2.5 minutes is an average scene, and then the scene changes. In cartoons and animated work, even early, things tend to change a lot quicker. So despite cue sheets being sent out for quite a few of these things, my understanding was just from reading about practice from these trade journals that a lot of musical directors would just pick one sort of jolly kind of tune and just go from beginning to end with this 3-minute piece of music, and not really try and get every single little bit of element of action as the scene changes it within the cartoon. In fact, the modern understanding of scoring music for animated films is something called Mickey Mousing. It's literally refers to a Disney character, and that's the idea that you really have to follow with the sounds closely what's happening on the screen. Mickey Mouse goes up the stairs, so you hear the xylophone go tick 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 tick, and he goes down here tick 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 tick, and it's all written into the music. As I said, it's called Mickey Mousing, and something that started to be developed in the 1930s, and it's almost impossible to do that in live performance. It's just really too hard to synchronize to that degree of fineness, that kind of thing. So that particular style that we're used to watching, the Warner Brothers cartoons and things, is something that really can only be done when you're recording the music, pre-recording it. And if it doesn't work out, this difficult synchronization you're trying to do with the xylophone or the violins going, when the character falls down the manhole, if it doesn't work out, you do another take in the recording studio. But in doing it live in a cinema, it's almost impossible to do that, and therefore was not something that was attempted. Another super long answer.
No. That's exactly some of the information I was looking for. I appreciate it. You hit the nail on the head there for me. Right. So I've got a couple more questions that are related to the sort of transatlantic aspect of this and that era. So I want to ask how film influenced the transmission of American values and American cultures among newly arrived immigrants during this time, right? This is a huge peak of immigration during this time.
Right. Well, sure. Well, the entire presentation would have a powerful sort of homogenizing effect. I mean, you would go these giant images, the behaviors of the characters on the screen were things that you were supposed to emulate. I mean, unless it was a villain, but the villains were vanquished. But the heroic characters, these sort of stereotype characters were things to be emulated. The entire presentation, again, the music, the architecture being in this lovely space, and also having the fact that you had to actually read English to understand the dialogue cards. The cards with the dialogue would flash on the screen at regular intervals, and you had to be able to read English, and there was a powerful motivating thing to want to know what's going on. So I'm going to work on my English. So when I go to the Rialto, and I'm in a cheap seat, it's only a dime, but still, it's beautiful, and I see this text on the screen. I want to know what's happening. An interesting true story about that. My grandfather told me this when he started going to the movies. He told me that that's actually how he learned how to read when he was a little kid, 5 or 6 years old. He said his first understanding of reading and why he needed to read was going to the movies, and he wanted to know what was happening. A little kid in Jersey City, New Jersey, in 1913. So I don't know if I again answered completely that question, but
no, you absolutely did. No, that absolutely makes sense, and it's fascinating. And I could ask you a million more questions all night, but it's about time to wrap it up for us.
Okay.
So I want to thank you so much for your time and for your talk and for your detailed answers to these questions. We're really honored and appreciate having you with us.
It's a great pleasure, and I hope that that your viewers and everybody feels free to communicate with us. The organization that's doing all this is called Paragon Ragtime Orchestra, and you can find us online. We're on Facebook. We have websites. We're kind of all over. But it'd be great to hear from you. Send us a message, and if you have questions, you know, I spend an hour every morning at email answering questions from around the world, and people have questions about historic music and historic theater, and so I'm happy to do that, and I'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. And you guys, if you will check on that THSO Transatlantic History website, or the PDF of the lecture notes for tonight are up here, and it's got a link there to paragonragtime.com, so you guys can head over there. And if you have Facebook, I encourage you to get on that Facebook page. The posts of the primary sources that are up there are always really valuable and really interesting. So there's a lot more to learn here.